Hey everybody, lesson 4, and what we're talking about here today is what happens to our culture and international relations the more things continue to change. And we know that America's culture and how Americans are feeling is all kinds of tumultuous, and really as 1956 approaches, that midpoint in the 1960s, what we're going to see here is that President Truman, a Democrat, decides not to run for president. He says, you know what, I'm not into it. He says, I need a break. Because Americans were really criticizing him for things that had happened on his watch. I mean, let's just take a look at this map, right? You can see here all kinds of things. We know the Soviet Union goes communist in 1917, but during President Truman's time in office, Eastern Europe goes communist. North Korea becomes communist. China goes communist. So really, Truman's idea of containment doesn't seem like it's doing as much work. Right? It seems like containment needs more development. It needs some changes to it. So the election in 1956 is going to be between a Republican Dwight Eisenhower, like the Dwight Eisenhower, the former General Dwight Eisenhower, and another Democrat named Adlai Stevenson. And Eisenhower's going to win for a whole bunch of reasons, and you can see them listed there, right? Here's the general that comes in, who helps us win the Korean War, who helps us win World War II. He wants both a strong military and a strong economy. We're going to talk a lot about that today. But he also promotes nuclear weapons as a solution to our problems because you can get, as he says, more bang for your buck. Think about it like this, right? Truman, we know, had been using what you see right here, limited war, right? War with limited objectives, limited resources, but that also means wars will take longer to fight. This means that those wars are going to be too costly. They're going to be more expensive. If you're having trouble kind of understanding what I mean by that, take a look at this, right? Here is World War II. Incredibly expensive, right? Here's the pre-World War II spending on our military, all the way up there during World War II. As soon as World War II ends, down it goes. But then look what happens here. June 25th, 1950, North Korea invades the South, and that military spending goes up again. Now, North Korea is no Nazi party. North Korea is no Italian and no Japan. But it takes us 3 years to help bring that conflict to a close because we don't go all in. We only go half the way in. You see that? Limited resources committed, right? Limited objectives. This means that as the war comes to a close, we're going to see something have to happen to the economy because we can't keep affording to spend this much on our military and get nothing out of it, right? We have to get something out of it. So Eisenhower's going to come along and he's going to say, you know what? We want to get more bang for our buck. We should use nukes as an appropriate and effective military strategy. That's his idea. He says, we can't defend the nation in a way which will exhaust our economy. We've got to use nukes if we need to use nukes. So, as president, you see Eisenhower saying, we've got to figure out something to do here. We can't keep fighting these small wars, these limited wars. We've got to do something else. And he calls his new idea for containment massive retaliation. The idea of massive retaliation is that we will threaten a massive response against any communist advance. And here's the trick, and this part's important, you need to understand this. You use massive retaliation, you threaten nuclear war in order to prevent wars from starting. That's the idea. His belief here is that if you have nukes, you should be able to keep the peace. We don't need some giant army to keep the peace. What we need is the threat of nuclear weapons, and you can see that here, right? Just a workable peace, or else atomic bomb, Eisenhower's face. That's the idea. Let's prevent war by threatening nukes anytime the communists threaten to advance. And by doing this, Eisenhower can help keep military expenditures lower than what they were during the Korean War. That's his idea. Keep them lower. Let's have a strong economy and a strong military. Here's how Eisenhower puts it. Every gun that's made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It's spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. Eisenhower will cut significantly military spending in order to keep an economy strong and take care of the American people. That's his idea. His belief, then, is that our society should promote capitalism because rich Americans won't want communism. If the economy is doing well, Americans will do well, and we will reject communism. So, international relations, we see massive retaliation in a way to stop communist influence and prevent war. We see a cut in spending, but relying on nukes to keep the peace. And we see this promotion of capitalism. Let's delve into this a little bit further. So what I'm going to do here for you as we take a look at this is kind of give you some case studies in massive retaliation. And at its heart, when massive retaliation is at play, President Eisenhower is using something called brinkmanship. The idea here is that, like this picture of the eagle and the bear, you go to the brink, like the eagle is here on his edge of the cliff, the bear is on his edge of the cliff, and you're staring each other down. You were getting ready for war. You were daring that Soviet bear. Just come one step closer, and I'm taking it to you. The idea is that nukes will make the Soviets back down because they don't want a nuclear war any more than we do. But the difference is we've actually dropped the bomb. They know we have the guts to do it. I'll give you some other case examples of where this brinkmanship in massive retaliation works out, because some people really kind of are afraid of this, right? Like, what happens if you go to the edge and the other guy doesn't blink? What if they actually start war? Will you have the guts to do it? And a good example of this would be China, right? And you can see here on the map, right, here's North Korea, had gone communist after World War II. You know, we fought in South Korea. And here's a little tiny island called Taiwan, and of course, communist China. When the communists took over China in 1949, anyone who didn't want to be communist fled. And the place that they fled to was Taiwan. And since 1949, China wants Taiwan back, and they still do today. They want to bring Taiwan back into China proper. People in Taiwan don't want that. So Communist China starts looking for ways in the 1950s to seize Taiwan, to bring it back into Communist China. But Eisenhower looks at Communist China as kind of like a barrier, a way to contain, or he looks at Taiwan, I should say, as a barrier, a way to contain communism in Asia. So he says to Congress, I need you to let me use force if we're going to protect Taiwan. Because look, we've got China and North Korea. And right along the line, we have our allies holding them off, keeping the commies contained. The South Koreans, the Japanese, Taiwan, the Philippines. We can't afford to let these countries fall to communist China. The conflict goes on for several weeks. And the president actually threatens to use nuclear war. And here's the scary thing, folks. He issued a resolution that effectively stated if China didn't back down within 2 weeks, he would actually drop the bomb. It was recommended that we drop the bomb on China. Thankfully, the Chinese do withdraw from Taiwan. We can withdraw from our threat of nuclear war, and everyone backs away from the cliff. Nobody goes over the edge. Another example, Suez Canal. You can see it down here. This right here, this little red area is the Suez Canal. It's owned by a French and a British company, but it's in Egypt. Egypt was an ally of the Soviets. So the Egyptian government, in an attempt to help the Soviets, hurt the British and French, who are part of the West, seized the canal. really sparks an international crisis because now Britain and France have had someone take things from their companies. So they go to war. They paratroop their army and their navy lands, and it's a full-out war going on in Egypt. Even Israel gets involved, invading Egypt to help the British and the French. When this happens, when Israel invades, when the British and French join the invasion, the Soviets come to their allies' help and say, listen, Britain, France, Israel, either you back down or I'm coming over this ledge. America, when it sees the Soviets preparing to actually invade, threatens nukes to everyone, not just the Soviets, but to also invade and to push back Britain and France as well. We actually turn on our allies in the West to point out how catastrophic a global fight here would be. In the end, all sides back down. Brinkmanship works. Massive retaliation works. Okay? But we all know that the big stick doesn't work every time, right? Sooner or later, someone's going to call your bluff. Sooner or later, someone's going to say, cross that cliff. Come at me, bro. And you have to either come at them or you back down, and you're the one who blinks. So Eisenhower recognizes that in all kinds of countries, we just can't always keep one country from invading another. We actually have to keep not just countries from invading, but we have to stop revolutions inside countries before they happen. So what Eisenhower says is, all right, let's look around the world at countries that are allies with the West, countries that you can see on this map that are in blue. And let's look for countries that might be able or might fall to communism, those here in pink or red. And what he says is, I'm going to support in these countries covert operations. The idea here is that it's a secret operation. It's not openly shown. And what we're going to do is turn the CIA, our spy agency, loose. And in these countries, and if you look at this map, most of these countries are developing nations because they haven't developed industry yet. They haven't gone through their own industrial revolution, so they're still developing that. And in most of these economies, you have a very few rich people who control the land and the wealth, and many, many, many poor people who work the land as farmers or herders or cattle ranchers, that kind of thing. So what we'll see is the CIA go in and try and prevent the communists from keeping power or gaining power. I'll give you two examples where we do this. And one of those is going to be in Iran, the other's in Guatemala. And the President Eisenhower says, you know what? I want you in both of those countries because in both of those countries we've got a communist dictator who is running the show, and that's no good. Can't have that. We want to get that communist dictator out there. We want to create a revolution inside that country, and we want our own guy in there that's going to be allied to us. So, CIA, covert operations in Iran and Guatemala are successful. They overthrow the anti-American leaders and they replace them with pro-American leaders. But I don't want you to think that these pro-American leaders are somehow wonderful people, because they're totally not. That's the guy we put into power in Guatemala. Yeah, his name's Efrain Rios Montt, and he's a dictator. Yeah, bona fide military dictator. This guy here, the Shah of Iran, overthrown. His name is Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Overthrown in the 1970s, crazy dictator all the way up to the 1970s as a king of the Iranian people. We will support anyone that we think will do well by us, that we think might be useful. We've done this all over the place. We've supported dictators as long as they were allies with us in our fight against the commies. Just scrolling down this list, you can see what I'm talking about. There's one in Cuba. There's the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, El Salvador, Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil. You can see the list. And in all of those cases, we're replacing these people with dictators. Chile, Paraguay, all of these are American-chosen dictators to keep the commies out. And the list is even longer than that. So, covert operations work in other places around the world, like Iran, like in Guatemala, but it's not going to work in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, it's a little bit more tricky because Stalin is going to kick the bucket in 1953. And this is like, oh my God, this could be the chance, right? What if we can get the Soviets to collapse? What happens, instead of the Soviet Union collapsing, a new dictator will emerge from the Communist Party. His name is Nikita Khrushchev, and that's him right there, bald guy. Khrushchev says, and this is what's really amazing about it, he says that he will tolerate greater freedom in Eastern Europe. And when we hear this, we begin to encourage rebellion in Eastern Europe. We want Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria and these other countries, Poland, to rebel. And Hungary does. Hungary enters a full-on, full-scale, rip the statues down, burn the tanks rebellion. But what we don't anticipate is Khrushchev actually sending the Red Army into Hungary. Eisenhower won't risk a full-out war. If he invades Hungary, if he sends troops in to support the Hungarian rebels, we could be looking at World War III. So we sacrifice the rebels in exchange for keeping the peace with the Soviets. Cold War prevails over hot war. And it takes on, after this, a new tone, because Khrushchev is going to begin to look for ways to show Soviet dominance. If the Americans are going to mess around in his backyard in Eastern Europe, on his side of the Iron Curtain, he's going to show America who's boss. Khrushchev responds to this use of massive retaliation by pointing out that America must want to start an arms race. He responds by beginning something known as the space race. He shows that Soviet technology is superior to American, and it is. He launches into orbit the first satellite ever. All it does is go beep, 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 beep with a radio, but it's still a monumental technical achievement. He even brags that the Cold War is over because they have shown how superior their technology is. And that's the scene that Eisenhower is seeing as he's leaving office in 1961. He's looking at this and he says, what am I going to do? We've got this relationship between the military and our economy. Are we going to have to increase spending? Are we not going to have to increase spending? What are we going to do? Because in some ways, his containment didn't work. Right now, we know that it worked in places like the Suez Canal, Guatemala, Iran, but it also failed to work in other places. His massive retaliation and his use of covert operations failed in Cuba, which becomes communist in 1959. In Vietnam, communists are beginning to rebel. In Cambodia and Laos, communists are beginning to rebel. We're behind in the space race. Eisenhower's attempts are mixed. And who's ever going to enter office in 1961 definitely has some work to do. What are we going to do to better contain communism? I just want to point this out right here. When Eisenhower realizes just how good the Soviets are becoming, 58, 59, 60, 61, you can see spending on NASA begin to increase dramatically as we try to figure out what to do in response to the space race so that we can show we're in charge of the Cold War. And we'll take a look at that next chapter.